Hello everybody, welcome back to C&S Corvettes here in sunny Sarasota, Florida. It's your Corvette buddy Lyle back with more interesting, fun, and exciting Corvette news and topics. Before we get started with the video, I'd like to remind you that if you do find my videos useful or entertaining or in any way fun, please hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing. It's not going to require you to do any emails. It's not going to send you junk mail, but only about 30% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to my channel. And the more subscriptions I have, the more that YouTube will promote what we do here to other Corvette owners. So if you could hit the subscribe, that would be great. If you want to be notified when I make a new video, click the little bell icon under the screen. And that way you will automatically be notified when new content from us becomes available. However, if you just want to subscribe and not be notified, that's fine too. But please hit the subscription button. Even if you never watch another one of my videos, it'll be like a silent thank you for the information that we've given you. Okay, enough of that. Moving on. Today, guys, we're going to go and do a little bit of a review and a history lesson on one of my favorite small but awesome Corvette stories. And that is the story of the original Corvette Grand Sport. There's a lot of myths and a lot of misunderstandings about what that program was, the cars themselves, and specifically where those hash marks on the fender of the '96 Corvette Grand Sport tribute car came from. So we're going to cover that, and I'm going to do it in a little different format. I'm going to try to do it where I'm showing you a lot more images and video instead of you just looking at, this, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read this for you. I've taken a good bit of time to write this script. I have drawn my information from several sources, articles online from magazines like Motor Trend, Car and Driver, Hemmings, just to try to get a amalgamation of the truth, because all the stories I read were slightly different. What I'm going to present to you today is the closest I can come to what actually happened. So, without any further delay, let me go ahead and begin the story of the Grand Sport. So to begin this story, we need to start in the very late 50s, very early 60s. Carroll Shelby's aluminum-bodied Cobras were owning the Corvettes at every racetrack in America. And they had no chance of keeping up because the Cobra weighed about 1,000 pounds less than the Corvettes at that time. Now, Zora Arkus Duntov, who is widely regarded as the father of the Corvette and certainly was the most race enthusiastic person to be involved with the Corvette program in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, knew that even the new upcoming 1963 Corvette Stingray wasn't going to be able to compete with the aluminum-bodied Cobras either, because it too was going to be far too heavy. So at that time, he decided that he had to meet that challenge, but unfortunately, he had a serious problem to overcome. You see, in 1957, General Motors President Red Curtis persuaded the American Manufacturers Association to pull out of any factory participation in the support of racing events. Now, the interesting thing is here, it's believed that Henry Ford II actually convinced him to do this because it would be in the best interest of America's youth, and it was irresponsible to be promoting hazardous or fast driving and all that good stuff. But he wanted to make sure that GM in particular wasn't going to be making performance parts or high performance cars. So, Red Curtis signs on to this agreement, and Ford, in gesture only, said that they would observe the ban as well. But in the meantime, they continued to supply special parts to racing teams through an outside agency. Under the guise of being an independent company, race teams like Holman and Moody worked closely with the Ford factory to develop and promote NASCAR and other racing programs and so-called, quote, export parts for Ford vehicles. Chrysler Corporation followed Ford's lead in that area, except they labeled their performance parts police packages or severe duty parts. They also had a bunch of their engineers working on the side on their off time to help race teams with their products. So in the end, GM was the only major manufacturer who really stuck to the ban, and that was exactly what Henry Ford II wanted. To sidestep this particular situation, Duntov decided that he was going to build 125 lightweight Corvettes as production cars. This was a minimum number of cars to meet the FIA homologation rules. so that you could run in the production car class at Le Mans. Because Zora Arkus Duntov's goal here was he wanted to run his new lightweight Corvette against the Cobras at the Le Mans 24-hour race in 1963. So once he completed those cars, even if GM wasn't going to be involved, he could sell them to people like Roger Penske and John Mecom to privately run these cars at those events without explicit factory help or support. He believed that going this route would enable him to sidestep GM's ban on racing. Bunky Knudsen, who was the general manager of Chevrolet at this time, approved his proposal, and the construction began on these lightweight cars. So these lightweight cars were Corvettes kind of in name only, because they had an extremely wafer thin fiberglass skin on them that was just like millimeters thick. It was very light. They had a tube frame chassis, they had tubular suspensions, they had Girling disc brakes, and they were fitted with an all aluminum 377 cubic inch GM specialty engine that was making about 550 horsepower, and it was mated to a 4-speed transmission. Shortly after this program just started to get rolling, GM's chairman Frederick Donner squashed Duntov's little program because he finally got it passed through Bunky Knudsen and finally got to him that this was happening. He canceled the program unequivocally and told Zora Duntov in no unequivocal terms, no racing. Now, the interesting part of this story was that 5 of those lightweight cars were already mostly through their production process when Duntov was ordered to cease and desist. So in spite of the directive, he completed those 5 cars, and these 5 cars would be the original and only true Grand Sports. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Le Mans race in 1963 was to be the debut of this new Grand Sport lightweight Corvette. But because they weren't allowed to produce 125 cars, they didn't meet the FIA rules for production class racing. So they ended up, in some of their warm-up races leading up to Le Mans, they were stuck in the prototype class, which means that they were facing cars like the Chaparral, the Porsche RS60, and the Birdcage Maseratis that were purebred racing machines that even the competent Grand Sports just couldn't compete with, so they didn't have very much success. Most of the competition that these cars competed in was in the SCCA modified class, and as I said, the bad thing was they were running up against the prototypes and they just couldn't compete. Worse yet, Carroll Shelby's Cobras had met the 125 car minimum, and they were going to be able to race in the amalgamated class or production class at Le Mans. Therefore, all the plans to send the Corvette to Le Mans were scrapped. But Bunky Knudsen, again, the GM chairman, went kind of not telling anybody else, went to Zora and said, look man, we got to find a way to, and I quote, stick it to the Cobras. Therefore, Duntov hatched the second part of his plan. So Duntov followed Knudsen's orders by loaning 3 of the Grand Sport chassis to a guy named John Mecom, a 21-year-old, yeah, I said that right, 21-year-old Texas oil tycoon and race car driver. Mecom agreed to let Duntov care for and update the cars as needed, and that he would be the one to campaign them to allow GM kind of plausible deniability. So Grand Sports 003 and 004 were returned to Chevrolet from the 2 people they had been loaned to, which was Dick Doan at Chevrolet and Grant somebody at Gulf Oil. I'll have to look it up. They were returned and they were then refurbished and updated. They got larger wheels and tires. They got the fender flares. They were just made much more road racing specific looking and handling cars, and chassis number 005 was also updated with those same improvements. So once those 3 cars were completed, 2 important things happened. All 3 were painted a color that was called light Cadillac metallic blue, which became very iconic because of what's about to happen next. They also pulled out the 377 cubic block engines and then moved 427s into them at some point. So the finished cars were shipped to Mecom in Texas. He did his race prep, and then the cars were loaded onto a ship and sent to Nassau in the Bahamas. Every year, Nassau in the Bahamas held what they called Speed Week, and it involved road racing, drag racing, boat racing, sailboat racing, every kind of racing you can imagine. And wealthy playboys from all over the Western Hemisphere would come over, bring their toys, and have just a great big party and race to their heart's content. This is where the legend of the Grand Sport truly began. So Carroll Shelby was actually at the docks dealing with some of his own stuff when the Grand Sports started being unloaded off the ships. And this worried him immediately, and he immediately began complaining that they shouldn't be allowed to run. To make things even worse for him, certain drivers showed up to be driving these cars. People like Roger Penske, Jim Hall, Dr. Dick Thompson, the flying dentist, Augie Pabst, and John Cannon, a former F1 driver. There were also a whole lot of Corvette engineers who, coincidentally, had taken vacation to the Bahamas for a week to observe what was going on. So they have the cars taken to the track, they do their run-ups, and this is where we come into the legend of the hash marks on the fender, right? So it's key to know that those marks, as important as they are historically and how they've been recycled throughout Corvette history over and over again, this happened once and only once in Corvette history. The Grand Sports were running at the airport in the Bahamas. And you have to understand, back in the day, there was no separate pit lane behind a wall. You had some traffic cones out there to keep the race cars more or less away from your guys as they were working on your cars and you were changing drivers. There was also no cell phone communication. There was no in-car radio. They just had placards that they held up and said, hey, come into pit, or hey, you're on fire. So it was a much more primitive, much more dangerous type of racing. As they went through the warm-ups and all of that stuff and getting the cars broken in, the problem they noticed became readily apparent was that all three cars were the same exact color, and you couldn't see the numbers on the sides of the car or on the hood of the car as they came driving down pit lane. So they quickly came up with a way to distinguish these three cars from each other. And what they did was they put stripes made of tape, not paint, on the nose, not the fenders of the car, one black, one red, one white, so that as the car was coming toward them in the pits, they could tell which car it was that was coming into pit. The three Grand Sports never raced that way again. It was just a single moment frozen in time, but it has become a huge part of Corvette history and lore, and no hash marks were placed on a Corvette ever again until the 1996 Grand Sport Tribute Edition, which, you know, the classic blue with the white stripe, the red hash marks on the fender, and the black wheels. You also saw them used later on in the C5R and C6R racing program. As for the showdown at Nassau in 1963, the Grand Sports put on an exciting show, beating the Cobras and finishing third and fourth behind two prototypes. Penske would return the following year in 1964 and take the overall win in another Corvette Grand Sport. Now, after these 2 years, the Grand Sports would continue to compete in different events around the world, but because they were going up against cars like the Cobra that were still being constantly improved and developed with factory help, they fell off the pace after a few years, and other than historical racing, they weren't really competitive after about 1967. After that, they were more or less retired and either put into private hands or into collections. All five original Grand Sports do still exist. They are all fully restored. Two of them are actually within 2 hours of my shop here in Sarasota, Florida. Chassis number 2 is owned by a gentleman named Bill Tower, who was a huge GM luminary back in the 60s and 70s. He lives up in Plant City. The other, chassis number 004, is owned by the Collier Foundation and is kept at a museum called the Revs Institute in Naples, Florida. If you ever are in Naples, Florida, and you like cars, I highly recommend you go visit that place because it has some of the most iconic and rare cars in full drivable trim in the world. That's basically it for the story of the Grand Sport and for my show for today. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you found it educational and fun. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Until then, have a great weekend and thank you for watching.